Hello, welcome back to my studio. Today I'm taking y'all on a guided tour of a limited color palette. Basically, we're gonna make one of these color charts. If you've ever seen these in the back of a artist studio and you've wondered, what is that for? That looks really cool. How do I do that? And why are they doing that? If you've ever had any of those questions, this is the video for you. Not only that, I'm going to walk you through how to read a paint label. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about paints and why swatching can be really helpful for an artist, whether you are a beginner and you're just learning about paints, or maybe you're a veteran artist and you want to sort of become more intimate, more aware, more familiar with your paints. I'm also going to walk you through how I made this little hand stamp that I use in my swatching and what all of these different elements mean and what you should be swatching for. And of course, walking you through how I made this. So if that sounds interesting, if you want all that information, stay tuned. Before I jump into why swatch pigments and what are paints made of, I'm going to put a timestamp here. If you just want to see the tutorial, the hand stamp, and watch me make this, then you can jump straight to that. But I do think it's important to talk a little bit about what is paint. I know that seems really rudimentary and I could be here for hours, but for all intents and purposes, paint is basically pigment suspended in a medium. So pigment is going to be the thing that gives whatever you're painting its color, right? It's the star of the show. And your medium is going to be what keeps it stable and what gives it its particular texture and viscosity. So they kind of work together. You know, if you have acrylic paint, you're going to have your pigment and then polyvinyl. If you have gouache, you're going to have your pigment and gum arabic. And if you have oil paint, you're obviously going to have your pigment and your oil. And it's important to note, while all of these different paint companies try really hard to control for everything and make paint seem as homogeneous as possible, there's a tremendous amount of labor that goes on that end. You can't control for everything, and it's important to know that pigment is a wide range of anything, right? Humans have been playing with rocks and plants and all kinds of things to figure out how to make color for basically the entirety of human civilization. If you go back to the earliest sites where they found human civilization in any capacity, you'll see that they have been painting. Usually it's like ground up ochre that they use for like hand paintings and wall paintings and cave paintings. And so the desire for humans to find cool color and make art with it is as long as human history. I just think it's cool. That's its own moment to geek out on. All that to say, we've been trying to make everything we can get our hands onto into color since forever, which means that all the things that can make a pigment is wide and varied. You know, anything from ground up rocks, that's going to be your sort of your ochres and your earth colors, all the way to plant dyes that are then bound and suspended in pigment, to our more modern recent synthetics. All of those are used to create pigment. And because it's such a wide variety of what is a pigment, that I think because of that, it's really important to get to intimately know your palette. So what do these pigments affect? Why does it matter that they're different? Well, the thing is, the kind of pigment you have is going to affect all kinds of things. Not only sort of the viscosity and the texture, but is this a matte pigment? Does it have a sheen to it? Or is it really glossy and it is nice and shiny? Does this have a really high opacity? Opacity just means the ability to cover what's underneath it. If something is very opaque, it'll cover it in one pass. Titanium white, for example, is a very opaque color. It does a pretty good job covering whatever's underneath it. That's why a lot of house paints are made with titanium white, because in order for the paint to be good, you don't have to put on 5 layers of paint. It's almost always mixed with white. So that's your opacity. If something's very translucent, it might still have a lot of color, but it's not going to do a very good job covering, which is a good thing to know, because sometimes as a novice painter, you can think, oh, this color is really strong. Well, strong might mean you just take a little bit of this blue, for example, and it's going to make everything around it really blue tinted. So you only have to drop a tiniest bit of phthalo blue green shade, for example, into yellow, and it's going to be green in a second. And so that could be strong, but strong could also mean really opaque. So it's good to know sort of these art terms. On that note, you also have color tinting strength. So this has a lot to do with the size of the pigment particle, but basically it's that same thing. So if you add just a tiny bit of this color to white, for example, is the white going to make it very, very pastel? Or is that paint strong enough? Does it have a strong enough tint power that it's going to be a really bright color, even when it's contending with titanium white, which is a beast of a white color? That's why it's used pretty predominantly these days. Now, certainly you can get to know your colors just by painting with them. I did that for a long time. I'm not much of a planner. And so I learned that way, but I also learned the hard way. Like for example, I would try to use a yellow to cover something, and I realized I have to have white in that yellow, at least for the initial ground, because the yellows that I typically use are really bright, but they're not very opaque. So it's just learning and sort of indexing, and it's great if you can create something where you can reference it. Hang it up in your studio, looks cool in the background too. But this also can help you if you're sort of troubleshooting an issue. Why isn't this covering? Here's my handy little chart, and it helps you sort of figure out maybe what's happening in your paintings. And then also specifically with this video, I am doing this with a limited palette. You can do this with any paint. If you go to the store, you buy a new set of paints, something I have started to do in recent years is I'll just grid out some paper, maybe make something like this, and I'll just test out my paints. What is the tint power? What is the surface sheen whenever this dries? Just all those things, and sort of document it. Plus, like, it's fun to play with new paints. So it kind of gives you an excuse to sit down and like look at your treasures. But I'm doing this specifically with a limited color palette, and I would recommend if you're brand new to painting, you do this too. So I'm briefly going to talk about what is a limited color palette. It's basically a color palette that has a limited amount of colors. I always think of it as 3 colors plus a white, but everyone has a different interpretation of that. So 3 colors, that's going to be your 3 primaries, whether that's red, yellow, blue, or cyan, magenta, yellow, whatever it is for you. Basically, you want to think 3 colors that, generally speaking, other colors can't blend to make those colors. They're going to be kind of the foundation of your color wheel. Don't worry, don't fret. They don't have to be perfect. Sometimes there's this conversation around color theory of like, what are the perfect primaries? And I think what people mean by that is the primaries that you can mix to give you the most access to the most colors. The thing is, if you get really close to like a perfect CMY, which is like cyan, magenta, yellow, it does give you the ability to mix all of these really, really bright, high chroma colors kind of on the very outside of the color wheel, where if you have sort of an imperfect group of primaries, so like more of a standard red, a blue, a yellow, that might not give you accessibility to make quite so bright violets, for example. But color is contextual. I think that trade-off is totally worth it. Just use whatever you have. You know, there's one of my favorite limited color palettes is the Zorn palette. There's not even a blue on that. Basically, you're using your titanium white and your black as a blue. I know, weird, but it totally works. And yeah, you can't get a lot of really rich violets and you can't get a lot of saturated greens, but color is contextual. I can make a whole video on that. All that to say, don't fret. Use what primaries you have accessibility to. For this video, I am using quinacridone crimson, cadmium yellow medium, as well as phthalo blue red shade, and of course titanium white. Before we jump into the tutorial of the hand stamp followed by the creation of this, I wanted to briefly talk you through reading a label on paint, because if you don't want to do this, if you're curious about paint, you clicked on this video because you're like, I want to know how to read paint, I want to know more about paint, you can also just read the label. This will serve you pretty well. I still recommend swatching your colors, because to give you one kind of final analogy about it, learning about your colors is like learning about people's personality. It's like, you know, kind of the way that that color behaves, how it blends, how it plays well with others. Does it play well with others, right? And so I still think it's really valuable. But if you're like, listen, I don't have time for that, like I trust you that red and yellow is going to give me some kind of an orange and I'm willing to deal with the variations, then before you go, I want to show you how to read a paint label. So whenever you have a paint label, you're going to have what's called the sort of marketing name. The reason it's called a marketing name is because it's the name of the paint, all intents and purposes, but there's no regulation as to what they can call it. And that might seem frustrating because you're like, well, if it's cadmium yellow medium, shouldn't there be a standard? Not necessarily, because sometimes the paint company's specific colors are proprietary, so they're not gonna have the paint number on it. Let me tell you an example. Liquitex has on all of theirs, their paint number right here. But on something like their cadmium-free yellow medium, on all their cadmium-free lines, they actually don't have it. And that's because the cadmium-free, cadmium is a heavy metal, it's toxic, you know, don't put it on your skin, right? Don't ingest it. So a lot of companies are trying to phase out the use of cadmium. Their mix is proprietary. They want to be able to be one of the only companies, you know, they're trying to make money, who says like, hey, we have a blend of colors that looks almost, if not exactly identical to cadmium yellow, and it doesn't have cadmium. Because it's proprietary, it's not going to be on their label. Companies have the right to do that. But most companies, most colors are going to have the pigment color on the tube. Sometimes it's just one pigment, like with this quinacridone crimson. That's going to be PV 19. So pigment violet, I believe, 19, or like PB is going to be pigment blue. PB 15.6, that's going to be pigment blue, and then the number. Sometimes numbers have like serial numbers behind it. All that to say, why would you need to know that number? You can kind of look it up. Another thing is a lot of colors, probably not with primaries, but a lot of colors are going to be a blend of different pigments. And so, you know, for example, I used to love Payne's Gray. I did a lot of nocturnes. I primed my canvases with it. And I learned that Payne's Gray was just ivory black and ultramarine blue. I'm not exactly sure of those colors, but it was a mix of black and blue. And then I was able to just make it myself. So sometimes paying attention to that, for all different reasons, it can be helpful. All that to say, where the marketing name is not going to have much necessarily have congruency between brands, the pigment number is. And so when you get really into the weeds of color theory and you need to know like exactly the pigment, you can look at this. If you're brand new to painting, disregard. It might be helpful one day. You also may see on your label a little sun icon or something that says light fast. Light fast just means, does this color fade over time? Of course, over enough time, most pigments fade. I mean, just go look at a person who's like a professional paint restorer or an archivist. Like, that's something they have to contend with. But, you know, for the most part, most of us want paint that's not going to fade in like 10 years. It's not to say that if you stick a painting right out in the sun on a south-facing window, like eventually it would and could fade. But this is sort of says like under normal conditions, is this paint going to fade within a lifetime or two? Most paints are pretty good, but you want to check and make sure that everything is pretty light fast. I believe with Liquitex, a 1 is like their highest ranking. I like to make sure most, if not all of my colors are 1s. You're also going to have on your paint something that tells you the opacity and transparency. So opaque just means it covers, transparent means that it doesn't cover what's underneath it very well, or it's like basically see-through minus the color shift. On them, you're going to have these little boxes. So sometimes they have a box that's halfway divided. That just means semi-opaque. If you have a box that is cut in half like this one, you can see here, that's semi-transparent. And then of course, just an empty box is transparent. I will say these are pretty true, but it's actually because I didn't always find that these lined up exactly with my experience of the paint that I started doing these paint swatches. Now, granted, maybe it's more to do with like I apply paint really thick, and so if something has a strong tint power, it kind of messes with the transparency. Probably almost certainly operator error, but this can be, generally speaking, a guide. I still recommend swatching, but that's going to give you what the manufacturer says is the opacity or transparency of the paint. You have a lot of other things happening on your label, stuff that's like in compliance with safety. You know, if you use your paint the correct way, that means you're not like putting it on your hot dogs or brushing your teeth with it. Please don't do that. The paint is safe. All kinds of stuff on here, right? I could go into it in depth in another video, but the last thing I'll mention is the series number. Now, the reason why there's a series number is because of the point that I stated at the top of this video, which is that pigment varies, right? Some pigment is like harvested in this really intricate process and it's really region specific, and so there's a lot of labor and costs and like export all kinds of things that can go into what makes something expensive. And then other paints are readily available, easily found, local, you know, can be manufactured like that, and so the price is going to be a little bit lower. And so instead of sort of having a different price for every paint, they have series, and that controls their prices, right? You might walk into an art store and there's literally 70 different paints on the wall, and instead of having 70 different colors, they break them down in series numbers that could be like, you know, 0 to 9 or 1 to 7. It kind of depends within each company, but that's going to try to the best of their ability to simplify the cost. So, you know, another thing you can pay attention to is if something's a really high series, you know, cadmium red, for example, tends to be a little on the pricey side. You might want to look at a different paint that is similar, especially if you're a newer painter and you're not really stuck in your ways. Find a different red that maybe has the same characteristics. It's semi-opaque, it's light fast, etc. And see if you can find one that's similar but less expensive. Sometimes painters get really stuck in their ways. You know, paint companies have a hard time pulling colors from the shelf, even if, like, for example, it's not a very cost-effective pigment, it doesn't sell that much, but if you pull it, inevitably there's going to be a handful of painters who like have to have that one specific color. Don't get stuck in your ways. Be more versatile, I would recommend, because you just can't control that. The very last thing I'll say about paint is there's something called a hue. I'm sure if you've seen it, right? Alizarin crimson hue, cadmium red hue. What does that mean? A hue basically means that color doesn't have the pigment associated with that color normally. So it doesn't have cadmium in it. It has different colors that the manufacturer has done their best ability to make it very similar to the point that they're going to have the same name, right? They're both going to be cadmium red medium, cadmium red medium. But to not deceive artists and to be really open, obviously as an artist, you can still look at that pigment number, and there is a pigment associated with cadmium red medium. But in order to have extra clarity, because again, artists are very particular, they will sometimes write hue at the end of it to let the paint buyer know there's not actually cadmium in here. This is a mix, a special recipe, if you will, that the company has come up with to look very close and function and feel a lot like cadmium, but it's not exactly cadmium. Some people don't like that. Some people are really true to their pigments, and so they'll avoid a hue. I've always liked them because, like, for example, there's something called an alizarin crimson hue. Like I mentioned earlier, alizarin crimson isn't the most light fast color, right? It won't hold up as long as the rest of my paints on my palette. So I like to paint with alizarin crimson hue because the hue has better light fastness, and I think they cost the same. So literally, I just think it's a better paint, but because they don't want to sort of offend the true alizarin crimson lovers, they'll just make two, have one a hue. Maybe one day they'll phase out the original. Who knows? I don't know. That's up to the company. But that's what a hue means, is it's not actually the pigment that makes something cobalt blue, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, whatever. But it's meant and manufactured and made to work, look, and feel just like the actual pigment. That's an overview on what you're looking at whenever you're reading a label. If you want to put all of the things that are on the label into action, this is where swatching your colors is going to come into action. And with that, let's just jump into the demo. I'm going to start by making the stamp. I will just say you don't have to make a stamp. This is me kind of going above and beyond, being a little bit extra. You could simply write out on your paper, whatever you're using to swatch colors. I would recommend that it's something that can support either the oil or the acrylic paint. They have paper that's specifically for oil and acrylic paint. That is what I'm using. I've seen people use watercolor paper. I would say be careful, maybe test it out first, because not all water paper is going to work the same. But you can simply write with like a pen that's not going to smear, something that's going to stain the paper, a rectangle with some lines on it so you can see transparency, and then a box at the bottom where you can write the name of the paint on it. You can Google it, that there's examples of this out there. You don't have to go this fancy. I don't mind. I've wanted to do this for a while. And I'm going to make sure I include a PNG of this illustration for you guys. If you want to use it, print it out and make one yourself, you are welcome to. But I'm including a little illustration of this tube of paint. I drew it on with a pencil, and I used I think either a wet or a dry erase marker. I like doing it this way because I can go around the thicker lines, and that's sort of how I figure out where the negative space is. There are lots of ways to do this. I'm probably not doing it the best way. I'm a painter and not a printmaker at all. But this works for me. This is how I made my logo many years ago. Is I just hand stamped everything. I hand stamped my thank you cards for years. And so I'm just using, I'm drawing upon old skills to do this. But I'm going ahead and I'm taking the little tool that came with the kit. I think this is just pink eraser, but I know it's specifically for creating hand stamps. And this little carving tool, which came in the kit, I think I got it at Michael's. It was fairly inexpensive back in the day at the time. But I'm carving this out. Part of the little panel that looks diagonal, the reason for that part is because one of the things that you want to test with your paint is the transparency. And whenever you're using a color on just like a white background, it's hard to know what the tint is and what the transparency is. Like some color is really strong on white, but if you're trying to get it to cover black or a dark color or pencil, it's very translucent. So if something covers completely, it's opaque. If something covers somewhat, it's translucent. And if something covers hardly at all, not at all, it's transparent. So every paint is going to have a different level of transparency and translucency. Like I mentioned earlier, you can read it on the label. But I always like to think that artists kind of have to be their own labs. So I feel like this is a tangent, but artists and scientists are like cousins. Artists are just like allergic to numbers, or at least I am. Maybe I'm just speaking to myself. But at their heart, they are all about experimenting and trying things out. And that's exactly what I'm doing with this stamp. So I also, if you can see, included a little rectangle at the bottom, and that is to write the name of the paint or the name of the mixture of paints, so that I can reference it later. Oh, there's my cat. And you want to make sure to have that so that you can reference this later, because it's fun to do. It's definitely a fun way to spend your time, but it's also important that whenever you are using this paper later, that it's a reference. So you want to clearly write everything down. One mistake I often make is thinking, oh, I'll remember this, and then I never do. So, learn from my mistakes and make sure that you have a place to write down your thoughts. So ideally at this point, if you're carving this out yourself, you have basically a place to put all your paints. I also will say that I use the bottom bit where the paint tube is slightly curled up to use a tint of all the colors. One thing is, like, you have tints and shades. Shades are your color plus black. Tints are your color plus white. I don't tend to use a lot of black from the tube, and I find that tints where you add white is helpful because there are some colors that are dark, and the darker a color is, the more it's absorbing light, the more difficult it is to see the full chroma or the full color of your paint. And so I like having the option at the bottom to add white to the color so I can see the chroma a little bit more clearly. Here I'm taking some water and wiping off some of the marker. I did not do a great job of it. I think I was just eager to get started. So you can take rubbing alcohol and probably get it all off. But I thought this was good enough. So now I'm going to stamp with an ink pad. I don't know where I got this. I don't know what it's made of. Truthfully, I probably should. And I'm just testing out the stamp here to see. A lot of times when you hand carve, you'll leave little bits in on accident, and it's important to know where the lines are. So if I remember right, I tried this out and there was a line on the edge that I ended up having to carve away because I didn't like that it was visible. But it's important to try to, experiment with your stamp and see how you like it before you commit to doing a whole page of these little stamps. And that's exactly what I did here in this instance. So you can see I'm taking that carving tool and I'm just getting the edge. You can leave it in. I think it looks nice. I remember old school clip art. Speaking to people who've been around for a while, used to have a big series of these little hand stamped icons. And so the little lines and stuff and imperfections, it's not the biggest deal if you include them, but I am just trying to make this look as nice as possible. And so here I'm going to go ahead and start stamping. What is the rhyme or reason to this? You probably could plan it out better. You want to have each of your primaries, each of your secondaries, each of your tertiary colors on here. And then I always like to have a couple of neutrals, like a neutral gray, a neutral brown. Usually I like to mix my own chromatic black. But what I'm doing here is I'm going to basically explore my limited color palette. So I think I mentioned it earlier, but Cad Yellow Medium, Quinacridone Crimson, Phthalo Blue Red shade, and of course Titanium White. So I'm going to take this limited palette, it's one of each of the primaries, and kind of learn what my colors I can make from it are. And by using a set of primaries and figuring out your secondaries and tertiaries, there's actually quite a bit you can learn. So here I'm going ahead and I took some of my titanium white, and it's funny because it didn't feel as opaque as titanium white usually is, but hey, we're all learning something here today. So then I went ahead and I took my yellow. You can see that after I mix the color straight from the tube onto my little stamp, I mix a tint, and you can see with the blue how helpful it is. You really get a better sense of the exact color whenever you have that option to make a tint, and especially with this purple, because the crimson and the blue are both pretty dark in value. The purple almost feels like it's functioning like a black, and by adding the white, I really can tell exactly what the chroma or how warm or how cool that specific purple is. And as far as like how much do you know of each primary to mix, you want to make sure that it feels like a perceptual blend of each of the colors. What I mean by that is like you're not measuring out like a milliliter of cad yellow medium and a milliliter of your crimson. It's more that you're blending until you get to a color that looks as though it's halfway between the two. Granted, this is something that can take a little bit of practice. It might be helpful to have a color wheel printed out, and that way you can sort of help gauge it. Another thing you can do, something that I should have been doing from the beginning, but you can see here, I'm playing catch up a little bit, is to help you find, your secondaries and your tertiary colors. You can start to make a color wheel in the corner. In fact, I think that this is really helpful. I also recommend you can see this little rectangle I drew above the bottom 3 paint tubes is going to be where I mix 2 complements to come up with some neutrals. But I really like having that on here when I swatch so that it's not that I just have like a list of colors. I basically can see how they interact with each other. And I think making a color wheel is really important. Sometimes it gets like a bad rep for being just like something for preschoolers to do. But I think, learning your color wheel goes beyond learning the orders of the colors. And it has more to do with developing a sense and a perception of how the colors sort of relate to each other. So what colors are the complements of each of your pigments? Because even within the context of like the pigments that you chose, what might be a red and green pairing with a different set of colors, the opposite of red might be more of a like bluish green or a teal. All of that to say, you have to be your own science lab. And so by doing this, you're really learning kind of your exact colors and how they interact with each other. A complement basically just means 2 colors that complete each other. And so, in one color wheel using a different set of primaries, the violet that you might make might be more blue in nature, and it might be a true complement to your yellow. But if the violet that you make is very red, then it's not actually going to be a really good neutral for that yellow. I'm getting into the weeds. I'm just trying to show you an example. But it's important to know how each of your colors work. And you would think, oh, any red and any green are going to be complements, but that's not always the case. So you can see at the bottom, I went ahead and mixed a brown and a black. Students are always so mesmerized whenever I mix a chromatic black, which is just a black made using lots of pigment and not just, carbon or something. But you can, by sort of mixing, in this case, it's quite a bit of blue and red and a little bit of purple, a little bit of yellow, that you do sort of find a color that is pretty darn close to a true black. And I think here I'm choosing a low chroma version of all my primaries. I have a low chroma or a more muted yellow, which looks kind of like a khaki. I have a low chroma red, which feels almost like a purpley red kind of. And then I have a low chroma blue, which almost functions like a cool gray. And then finally, I am doing what I told you guys earlier, which is taking 2 high chroma colors that are complements, or in this case, complement-ish, and mixing them across from each other. In both of these cases, I think I had a little bit too much yellow in both the blue and obviously in the orange. And so my neutrals feel very green. If I had more time and energy, I might do this again and pick different complements. But that's the point of learning. That's the point of experimenting with all of the different colors on your palette, is that you learn the intricacies and the specificities of all the colors that you are using. Hopefully that was helpful. I really enjoyed making this, and I can't wait to hang it up in my studio so it's part of my background and it can look very official. Hopefully you learned something from this and feel a little more confident with your paints, and you know why artists swatch, and it's something that's going to help you in your practice. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I love making educational videos about color. This is the kind of stuff that I wish I would have known earlier. I jumped into painting. I had a teacher that just kind of threw us in the deep end, and I loved him for it. But there's a lot of things that I saw other artists doing, and I was like, am I missing out on something? So I'm trying to share as much of that as humanly possible with y'all. So thank you again. Happy painting. Take care, and I'll see you in next week's video.